Wominjeka, Wominjeka. Greetings from Wurrundjeri, Wurrung country. And thank you, Sean, for that kind introduction, and to all of the organisers for inviting me today and for accommodating the time difference so that I could be here at a reasonable hour of the day. It's such a pleasure to join you, although it's virtual. Before proceeding, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, the Wurrundjeri Wurrung people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and future. This is symbolic language, and it seems especially fitting to begin with a formal acknowledgement of country in this presentation today, because symbolic language, which is to say the power of words to shape reality, is in fact my underpinning theme. Saying these words is an act of bringing something into being. In this case, first, the recognition and perhaps later restitution for Aboriginal Australians. Even casual language can alter a moment, giving offence, a compliment, a slip of the tongue. When the stakes of the interaction are high, even such ephemeral moments have consequences. A consistent approach to language, what we might call a discourse, especially if it's formal language in official contexts, employed in the name of a powerful person, well, that can change a whole political environment. It can shape expectations, define the contours of debate, and articulate the characteristics of belonging, or perhaps not, among the favoured. Of course, formulae can also be empty. We can parrot them without commitment, and sometimes with the express intention of doing precisely the opposite in the very next moment. And these observations were no less true in the 13th century than they are in the age of Twitter. Contemporaries knew Edward I to be a persuasive user of language, and this was not necessarily a positive view. The Dominican chronicler Nicholas Trivet described how, despite his lisping tongue, Edward did not lack the eloquence effective to persuade in matters to be discussed. But the anonymous author of the Song of Lewis, a poem in favour of rebellion against Henry III in the 1260s, was even more frank. He openly regarded Edward as duplicitous. The poet warned his audience to be alert for Edward's guile and to doubt the apparent meaning of his pleasant speech, saying, as you can see on the screen, "A lion by pride and fierceness, he is by inconstancy and changeableness a pard, changing his word and promise, cloaking himself by pleasant speech. When he's in a strait, he promises whatever you wish, but as soon as he's escaped, he renounces his promise. The treachery or falsehood whereby he is advanced, he calls prudence. The way whereby he arrives whither he will, crooked though it be, is regarded as straight. Wrong gives him pleasure and is called right, and whatever he likes, he says, is lawful, and he thinks that he is released from law as though he were greater than the king." Such a man obviously understood the power of words to shape reality in his favour, and in the hands of such a man, letters were powerful and potentially dangerous tools of political manipulation. Before I continue, Hannes, did you switch the recording on? Thank you. Okay, so my presentation today, as Sean has mentioned, draws on the research and arguments that I present in my forthcoming book entitled The Letters of Edward I, Political Communication in the 13th Century. Although I focus on Edward I, the book is not a conventional biography. If you want a good biography, I can recommend some of the works of colleagues in the audience tonight, including Andy King's Edward I, A New Arthur, or Mark Morris's A Great and Terrible King, if the heavy weight of Michael Prestwich's volume in the Yale series is too much for you. My book is not like that. Instead, it is a study of medieval political communication, which takes Edward as an example and the letter as its foundational format. It's about the power of language to persuade and the limits of that capacity. It's about how medieval kings made use of the power of language and how they adapted when it faltered. Edward is an excellent case study for examining such questions because of his acknowledged rhetorical prowess. The enormous volume of epistolary materials that survive from his reign, and because he ruled in a period in which political rhetoric was increasing in importance. As Virginia Cox has argued, wherever the criteria and meaning of political participation were contested, rhetoric had a crucial part to play in political culture, and this was certainly the case in late 13th century England. The success that Edward enjoyed in binding the political community to his endeavours, especially in the first 2 decades of his reign, tends to obscure the fact that this was a time of change and a time of challenge. As you may know, Edward came to the English throne in 1272, following 2 reigns in which the relationship between king and nobility had been disrupted by dispute and violence. Both his grandfather, King John, and father, Henry III, about whom you may have heard last week, had faced armed rebellions. In the latter part of Henry's reign, both the king and his eldest son, among other senior royal men, had been captured by baronial forces under the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. And it was Edward's dramatic escape from this imprisonment at Hereford in the summer of 1265 that ultimately precipitated royal victory, the Earl's death, and a fragile peace. By 1272, the previous 6 decades had seen regular, repeated reissuing of Magna Carta as a totem of royal commitment to baronial relations. But the very frequency at which this was demanded and performed hinted at the continuing tensions. Debates about the nature of political participation, both in terms of to whom it belonged and to what extent it included the capacity to constrain the king, lay close beneath the surface. For the Crown, the most dangerous potential development was the fact that alliances might develop between the magnates and the middle orders, and this had been a feature of earlier 13th century rebellions. In my book, I posit royal letters as one of the rhetorical mechanisms by which, if well used, the king could disrupt the potential for such alliances to form among those who might have opposed him. In their place, letters could evoke a world in which the king's correspondence belonged in special and exclusive relationship to him and shared in his ideals and assumptions. I argue that letters as texts, as performances, and as cultural products were perfectly suited to this task. In fact, they were agents in medieval political process. Because a letter had to speak for the sender in their absence, there would never be an opportunity to respond to a recipient's questions or to rebut their counter-arguments as there might be in regular speech. And for this reason, contemporary theorists argued that the letter qualified as rhetoric and in fact, in some respects, needed to be a more rhetorical construction than any other form of political communication. Consequently, medieval epistolary theory, also known as the ars dictaminis, defined a common underpinning structure for letters that was explicitly concerned with moving the mind and the passions of the recipient in favourable ways. In the form that came to be commonly known in England, such theories divided letters into 5 parts, with distinct roles to play in securing the agreement or obedience of the recipient. First came the salutatio, or greeting, expressed in such a way as to honour, flatter, and respect the recipient according to their relative social position in relation to the sender. Next came the exordium, also known as the captatio benevolente, which is a word that I always struggle with for some reason. This was an opening statement or aphorism that was explicitly intended to put the addressee in a receptive frame of mind. This was followed by the narratio, which is to say an explanation of the context that generated the need to write, and then the petitio, in which this need was expressed as a request, command, or instruction. And finally, the conclusio closed the letter by some means that affirmed its importance and once again encouraged compliance. So these 5 parts were discussed widely by epistolary theorists, in particular the salutatio, which was often quite elaborated in rhetorical texts. But in fact, all of these parts were really reflexes of the captatio. Every part of a letter had to play its persuasive role. For instance, as Brunetto Latini explained in his Rettorica of about 1260, whoever greets the other person through the salutation of a letter seems already to have begun his exordium. Everything about the arrangement and the expression of the salutatio was relevant to capturing the goodwill of the recipient. And this included, for instance, ordering and the description of the sender and addressee, respectively. The more exalted correspondence name should be placed first in the position of highest honour, while between equals, the sender should place his or her name second as a mark of humility. Letters were always inscribed and shaped by such signs of difference in status, however slight, because distinction was as fundamental to the nature of letters and to their rhetorical effect as it was to all socio-political interaction and identity. Similarly, language in the greeting and throughout the letter needed to be tailored to the socio-political status, values and virtues, and to that attended specifically upon recipients' office and rank. And this was true both in absolute and in relative terms. The artes, the texts that expressed this ars dictaminis, often went so far as to list the vocabulary that should be appropriate to certain sender-recipient relationships. For instance, loyalty should be used to address lay elites, but not members of the clergy, for whom reverence was more appropriate. These terms then reflected ideological concepts of the proper qualities of relationships engendered by a recipient's social position, and they indicate one of the subtle ways in which letters were always ideological texts. The development of the theory of letter writing, articulated first in Bologna and further developed in Orléans and Capua, was intensified by the importance of letter writing in the great conflicts between empire and papacy in the High Middle Ages. And this was so true that it extended to fictitious letters circulating as aspects of propaganda, as well as to those which were actually exchanged between the parties. In this crucible, the papal and imperial approaches to epistolary were forged and became associated with the most outstanding contemporary expressions of sovereignty and imperium. As Benoit Grevin has argued, this linked letter writing to a fundamentally European language of power. It was an art worth emulating for any prince of ambition, a quality that certainly characterised Edward I. The ars dictaminis was known in England from at least the reign of Henry II in the late 12th century, when Eleanor of Aquitaine's secretary, Peter of Blois, or some other person in senior English royal circles, produced an ars of the Orléanais style with an accompanying formulary of examples. But as Lucy Hennings has shown, the promotion of dictaminal arts in English royal circles really began in earnest during the reign of Henry III, in association with his continental ambitions for himself, his brother, and his second son. Edward I continued and expanded that promotion, bringing a number of dictatores into his service, who had experience in the papal chancery or in that of the kings of Sicily with its imperial heritage. As I discuss in the book, some of the earliest examples of letters sent to his administrators in England after Edward's accession in absentia to the throne from his base en route home from crusade in his cousin's Sicilian court bear the influence of this high continental style that had been brought into his secretariat by men like Stefano di San Giorgio, a diplomat formerly in the service of the Sicilian king, who had connections to the most admired dictatores of the age. These letters, in which I contend San Giorgio had an active role, employed the rhythms of the cursus curiae Romanae, or cursus, which was associated with the epistolary style of the most refined and powerful type, as well as an unusual vocabulary that referenced papal language, particularly in connection with the bull Laudabilita, famous in English circles for at least apparently justifying the English conquest of Ireland in the 12th century. Treasuring this as an example of excellent and powerful royal epistolarity, Walter de Merton, Edward's interim chancellor, reused both the structure and the distinctive vocabulary of this correspondence when he reissued commands to the Seneschal of Ulster in the king's name in the following year. Models of powerful language like this, then, were very quick to enter circulation among those whose work was fundamental to governing Edward's domains. For the most part, however, English royal letters appear less rhetorically elaborate than their continental counterparts. And this has led some scholars to essentially dismiss them as rhetorical products. But I mount a counter-argument, namely that the customary form of royal correspondence in England was exquisitely well tailored to its audience and needed to draw only supplementary forms of authority from the continental traditions of dictamen or the rhythms of the cursus, which it did not hesitate to do should the need arise. In general, however, and particularly for domestic rather than diplomatic consumption, English royal letters resembled the writs that had been adopted from older practice by the post-conquest kings of England as a means of demonstrating the continuity, the legality, and the legitimacy of their rule. It was a terse, legalistic, and formulaic style, which seems on the surface not to offer much scope for rhetorical elaboration. But I argue that this style was in fact a profound asset rather than a restriction on the authority and persuasive capacity of royal correspondence. And here I might also add that in fact the precise, terse and formulaic style against which minute rhetorical divergence could take place, in fact, through even very tiny adjustments into sharp relief. As has repeatedly been demonstrated in a variety of contexts, not least his claim to superior lordship over Scotland from the 1290s, Edward was a legalistic king. He reached for legal and historical precedent to justify his actions and to represent them as legitimate to others. He was concerned to avoid legal loopholes in his actions and his words, and he trained his officials to be attentive to the same concerns. One of his advisors, William of Sardin, for example, warned Edward in relation to his correspondence with Boniface VIII on the matter of Scottish claims to avoid any potential for facts to be misconstrued or used against him. In his words, the letter must contain no obscurities, hesitations, doubts, or damaging statements which might be interpreted against you. In other words, it was not only the king who cared about legal precision. Michael Clanchy famously described a literate mentality at work in England at this time. To this, we might add a legal mentality that permeated English political culture. The King's English correspondents, nearly all of whom were men and a few women of elite status or officials of consequence, were familiar with writs and courts and related mechanisms of navigating the requirements of administering and defending their lands and interests. The writ, then, structured their expectations of authoritative epistolarity. It was itself a discourse of power in a complementary way to that of continental dictamen. Given these contextual factors, I argue that the terseness and observance of a fairly limited and legalistic vocabulary of royal letters was itself taken by recipients as a sign of their authority. One other important source of rhetorical power that I want to draw attention to before I move on to some further examples was the king's voice. And here I want to pay tribute to the late Mark Ormrod, whose probing questions and persistent encouragement were fundamental to the book's emergence in its final form. It was Mark who asked me what I made of the fact that, with the exception of the salutation, letters are characterized by their expression in the first person, unlike, for instance, the petition, which developed a customary third-person format. Marx worked together with his many collaborators on the Ancient Petitions project that delivered such wonderful digital resources to scholars, as well as an enormous volume of valuable commentary and analysis, has drawn our attention to the fact that the grammatical framing of petitions was one of their rhetorical strategies. The third-person voice of petitions operated within a suite of strategies that were oriented towards externalizing the petitioner's complaint, making it one with wider communal and even abstract ideological implications. Ormerod showed, for instance, how petitions were crafted to express the clamour of a problem, implying its coherence with a common complaint and linking its resolution to the communal good. And similar explanations can be advanced for the strategic citation of developing legal concepts such as equity and the explicit mention of reason. As Gwilym Dodd and others have noted, the third-person positioning of a petition emphasised the dissociation of the petitioner from the process by which the petition itself was advanced. And this, I would add, offered different advantages to those who had no personal access to the king than it did for those whose access was in fact plentiful. When figures such as the king's cousin, Edmund, the Earl of Cornwall, made a petition, it enabled them to represent their complaint as if it were an abstract and objective one, free of nepotism and open to transparent scrutiny. And it enabled them to be seen in a public forum to make this request. And this was undoubtedly a rhetorical choice. The first person of letters, I argue, should also be read as a powerful choice in rhetorical positioning. And it had two important implications that I want to highlight tonight or this morning. First, in contrast to petitions, letters explicitly framed whatever matter they addressed within the personal contours of the relationship between sender and recipient. The relational hierarchy and ideology infused the terminology of the salutatio, as Latini noted. And this wasn't incidental to the letter's rhetorical substance, but integral for capturing the recipient's goodwill. There we go. Royal letters, like other letters, employed a selective vocabulary that emphasised the interpersonal nature. Let me just check the time. There we go. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Do apologise. Let's go back there. And from current slide. Sorry about that. Royal letters, like other letters, employed a selective vocabulary that emphasised the interpersonal nature of obligations that encouraged a certain course of action. For instance, in 1275, when Alexander III, King of Scotland and Edward's brother-in-law, was only lately returned to Scotland from Edward's coronation and very recently widowed, the Scottish king capitalised on Edward's familial goodwill by writing to renew a request in favour of the Seneschal of Scotland. In this letter, the Latin text of which you see on screen, Alexander called Edward our most beloved brother and sent greetings and always increasing sincere love, asking with a more attentive affection that he would deign to show favour and benignity for love of us, and hoping to be bound to give him fruitful thanks for his intervention. Alexander's correspondence often appealed to the long and unwavering affection between the English and Scottish royal families, attempting to ensure the truth of this representation through his words. The heartrending language of the letter in which he informed Edward of the death of his son in April of 1284 and asked for his support for Alexander's daughter Margaret, who was now his heir, also represented granddaughter, I think, sorry, now his heir, also represented their bond of kinship as a warm and unbreakable one. The familial and familiar language of such requests was specifically enabled by the first-person framing of letter writing. It could not have been rendered successfully or effectively in the third person. And of course, royal letters benefited from a second and considerable advantage in that it was the first person voice of a king or sometimes queen. This was another aspect of the epistolary form that lent it a special authority to convey royal commands and to invest royal requests with adjussive force. As the Summa Magna, often attributed to Ralph de Hengham, Chief Justice of the King's Bench, observed, the language of command should be modified in writs addressed to different persons according to their status and relationship to the Crown. And this same practice was observed in all royal correspondence. Those whose office placed them under the King's direct command should be instructed using the verb praecipere. The nobility and ecclesiastical lords whose service was honourable and governed by homage more than oaths of office should be instructed using the verb mandare. The latter carried less servile and directly commanding tones while nevertheless constituting a command. And where other parties lying outside the King's jurisdiction, or in matters in which the recipient was not obliged by oaths, homage, or custom to comply, the King could only request, using the verb rogare, sometimes intensified in the company of requirere. The Summa's attention to this aspect of epistolary rhetoric illustrates how questions of legal accuracy and jurisdiction overlapped with those of socio-political position and persuasion. It was ostensibly the adoption of the phrase rogamus vobis in the King's writs of summons of 1297 for magnates to serve in defence of the good of the realm and the King's advantage against the injuries perpetrated by the King of France that precipitated the famous refusal of the Earls of Hereford and Norfolk to serve and led to the so-called crisis of 1297. Of course, there were in fact many contributing factors to such a breach of normal political relations, but it's telling that in their refusal, the Earls described these writs as insufficient. They recognised the space that rhetoric had left, at least technically, for a request to be refused, where a command could not. And they observed the careful silence that the royal writ had drawn around the question of where the service was to be performed and whether the King himself would be in their company, both points on which the Crown was in fact attempting to innovate under the cover of customary forms. For our purposes today, the critical lesson of this episode is its witness to recipients' familiarity with the standards of royal epistolary language and their attentiveness to both its rhetorical power and the limits thereof. Although it seems that legal technicalities and the challenges of imposing new obligations in a climate of close scrutiny of royal claims, along with, it must be said, an element of misjudgment, although these contributed to the poor reception of the 1297 writs of summons, typically when the King and his clerks produced letters in his name, they did so in the awareness that the audience would be a savvy one. It was crucial, therefore, that the wording should be carefully considered and appropriate to the predicted context of reception. The fact that many of Edward's letters survive in draft form in the collections of the National Archives gives a precious and important insight into the nature of the collaborative production of the King's epistolary persona. And this is especially revealing of the kinds of concerns that generated anxiety in royal circles, and of the values and virtues on which the King presumed to be able to encourage commitment from his correspondence. In the draft letter shown here, addressed to the barons of the region of the Agenais in Gascony, who had abandoned their allegiance to Edward and pledged themselves to the King of France following his annexation of the duchy, shows just such a process of collaborative drafting at work. It was intended to persuade these barons to return to Edward's allegiance as Duke of Gascony, and it promised them recognition for their assistance and to return their help in future, whilst reserving to the King the right to subject them to some proportionate punishment for their temporary misdemeanour. The narratio, or stipulation of circumstances leading to the letter, had originally opened with confidentes, trusting that they would not abandon their customary loyalty. But this, as you can see, was marked for deletion by an underline and replaced by, in a second hand, by the suggestion sperantes, hoping. This suggestion framed all that followed in a much more optative mood and avoided the suggestion of command. Furthermore, the explanation of Edward's grievances against the French king, his cousin Philip IV, was also amended in the course of drafting with this interlinear addition, probably in the main hand, although it's very tiny and a bit hard to tell, which described the injuries as being to our manifest disherison, a complaint that was presumably felt to appeal to Gascon sensibilities. A number of other vocabulary suggestions and minor grammatical corrections were also suggested in the main and supplementary hands. This letter and a series of others addressed to high status recipients concerning the fraught relationship between England and France on the question of Gascony at this time, sometimes known as the Gascon crisis, were drafted by the same hand, probably one of the proto-notaries of Chancery, while the king was personally present at Westminster in the October of 1295, and there is no reason to assume that he wasn't directly involved in the discussions concerning what the letter should contain and how it should be expressed. In fact, a surviving letter from the Queen Mother, Eleanor of Provence, is explicit in its expectation that Edward would involve himself in the drafting of important letters, or at the very least, assure himself of their appropriate content and wording before allowing them to be sealed and sent. In connection with her long struggle in the French courts to be recognised as a co-heiress of her father, the Count of Provence, and to access her share of the proceeds of the county, she'd prepared a letter in support of her cause in the king's name. The letter itself no longer survives, but the Queen Mother's covering note is extant, and in it she asks her son to have it read, and if it please you, have it sealed and sent to your aunt, my Lady of France, which is to say Eleanor's sister, Queen Marguerite. But if not, Eleanor continued, cause it to be amended to your satisfaction. This kind of personal attention to his correspondence is also evident in Edward's own drafted letters. In a reprimand sent to the Earl of Dunbar, the draft initially referred to the Earl's alleged cowardice with the comment, tant comme chien chie, when the dog shits, implying the completion of the phrase, the wolf takes off in the woods. This, in the final edit, was replaced by a less scatological but nonetheless pointed reference to La Chanson d'Ogidier, I do apologise, described by Michael Prestwich as a work of startling obscenity, in which the cowardly anti-hero fails to draw his sword until the fighting is over. It's simply not credible that such a profanity could have entered the records of the wardrobe without reflecting the king's own, sometimes coarse turn of phrase. And this was not an isolated instance. In a letter to the physician attending Edward's second wife, Margaret of France, for example, the king warned him not to move the queen until she was fit, or by God's groin you will pay. These insights into Edward's own habits of speech lend credibility to the chronicle accounts of his wording on the handing over of Scotland to his lieutenant, saying, "A man does good business when he rids himself of a turd." While Edward's personal participation in letter writing is clearest to see when the language is particularly abrupt or unusually rude, I argue in the book for the likelihood of royal participation in many moments of epistolary production, especially when the political implications were significant. An example of this is the correspondence directed to Llywelyn ap Griffith, Prince of Wales, in the interbellum period between Edward's two Welsh wars, during which the question of Llywelyn's rights in the otherwise relatively insignificant region of Awystli threatened to undermine the jurisdiction of Edward's royal courts and the reputation of his parliament, two things that were fundamental to the discourse of his legitimate rule. Within the cut and thrust of this correspondence, the Welsh side of which has recently been discussed in detail by Hugh Brodie in a most stimulating article in Studio Celtica, one royal reply alone took at least 2 days and 3 drafts to perfect. At the Michaelmas Parliament of 1279, Edward and his council were once again considering Llywelyn's complaints concerning the long delay of resolving the case. Debate had been mired in the question of jurisdiction and the application of Welsh or Marcher law, so much so that the substance of the case had yet to be heard after over a year of preliminary discussion. On the 24th and 5th of October, the king and his council, several members of which were also senior clerks in the Wardrobe and Chancery, considered how to frame an appropriate response. These drafts, which I discuss in detail and print in an appendix to the book, were heavily annotated, especially in the narratio, the section which, as Laurie Shepherd has argued, in connection to papal correspondence of this period, bore an important, in fact critical responsibility for demonstrating the rationality of the premises of the communication, and also in the sanction that occurred within the conclusio, in which the recipient was encouraged to act in a certain way in order to avoid undesirable or secure desirable outcomes. The King's letter in response to Llewellyn's complaint ordered an adjournment, yet another delay. And so this required a particularly delicate rhetorical balance in order to avoid, if at all possible, the accusation of favouring the opposing party in the case. The material traces of collaborative editing of this letter, which unfortunately I don't have permission to show you today, that the King and his council show that the King and his council were especially anxious about the framing of the justification and of the adjournment, and the nature of the Prince's representatives who should be summoned to a new hearing, as well as the role of the King and the council in deliberations. In 3 stages of editing, every effort was made to remove opportunities for further appeals and complaints by the Welsh Prince, and to assert in the strongest possible terms, without violating the norms of politeness, the King's political supremacy and procedural agency. They considered and rejected a number of amendments and introduced others until an acceptable text was reached, one that removed any language that might seem prejudicial, particularly by appearing to represent the allegations of the opposite party as facts. It also removed, after due consideration, all language that might appear to promise certain outcomes or even a specific deadline to which the King might later be held. Although the volume of correspondence generated in Edward's name was such that it would have been impossible for him to be directly involved in all of them, in high status, high impact letters of this kind, especially when drafted in association with moments of political or diplomatic assembly, they no doubt warranted royal executive attention. Furthermore, as I argue in the book, such moments could offer an additional opportunity for epistolary theatre, another avenue by which a canny politician such as Edward could encourage his audience of magnates and officials, and perhaps even diplomatic partners, to identify with his goals. In the case of Edward's correspondence with the Prince of Wales, the King's letter to the Prince was also witnessed and actively engaged with by an audience of his most important political community, which is to say his council. Since among Llewellyn's accusations and complaints was included the charge that Edward's councillors were giving him malicious advice and misrepresenting Llewellyn's loyalty and motives, the fact that his reply was produced in their presence and with their collaboration served to perform Edward's continuing confidence in them, just as the text of the reply, on which they all agreed, robustly defended them against the charges of impropriety and falsehood and reasserted the King's right and indeed expectation of taking their counsel. This message would have found an appreciative audience among the councillors, just as Llewellyn would have understood its pointed rebuttal of his complaint. Another forum in which the performance of letter production gained political importance was the settlement of disputes and of treaties. In 1273, for example, when Edward was at the French court, with the French court at Melun-sur-Seine, having only recently performed homage to Philippe III and agreed on the terms of his ducal tenure in Gascony, he produced 2 important letters to his lieutenants in England, and I hypothesize that the French king and senior members of his administration were likely among the audience of this moment of dictation and editing. The first was a letter which I mentioned earlier as an important example of the highest continental style influencing English royal epistolarity. It was addressed to the Chancellor, Walter de Merton, and thanked him for his service, asking him to continue that which you have so praiseworthily begun, and to commit himself afresh to exhibiting justice to everyone in those things pertaining to your office, inducing others to do so equally, sparing neither the condition nor status of anyone, so that the rigour of law might punish those whom the sweetness of equity cannot restrain from injustice. This was an explicitly ideological statement about the purpose and virtue of office in Edward's government, of the kind that he was often anxious for foreign potentates to be aware. In his letters to Pope Gregory, for example, Edward sometimes referred to the obligations of his coronation oath, both as a reason to explain his delay or incapacity to fulfil a papal request, but also as a measure of self-promotion, drawing attention to his virtuous commitment to kingship. In 1273 at Melun, Edward's letter to his chancellor was immediately followed by another, issued, as the letter itself bears witness, in direct response to the intercession of Philip III himself on behalf of Edward's aunt, Eleanor, the Countess of Leicester, and widow of Simon de Montfort. This letter, I suggest, could have been drafted in Philip's presence as a display of courtesy and a sign of the new diplomatic accord between the two kings. Its text concerned an explicit exercise of the general ideals of good governance that Edward had impressed upon his chancellor in the accompanying letter, and it gave ostentatious credit to the French king for the specifics of its contents. If Philippe did indeed witness the production of this letter, such a moment could have been choreographed by the English party in order to perform Edward's goodwill towards his French cousin and to promote future friendly relations between the two. Literary constructions of royal and papal letter production support such a reading of communal editing and production of letters as a means of building identification with a ruler's aims and generating a sense of belonging in a privileged community of participants. In Matthew Paris's French Life of Edward the Confessor, composed in the early 13th century and dedicated perhaps to Edward's mother, Eleanor of Provence, two letters figured in an elaborate story describing the saint's restoration of Westminster Abbey. In this episode, hearing letters and participating in their production and reception served to define at least two kinds of relationship to the royal centre, which varied by intimacy and political status. Having vowed to make a pilgrimage to Rome, but being dissuaded from travelling by his people who feared to lose him in the absence of an heir, the confessor sent envoys to Rome to seek absolution from his vow. Upon receiving this embassy, the Pope called his court together to consider his reply, and it was eventually written up in epistolary form. The text had first been read aloud in the presence of the Pope's advisors, who all affirmed and assented to it, and then registered, having been read aloud by the common will and consent of the plenary council. And you can see here in the Cambridge manuscript an illustration of Edward's emissaries arriving and being answered. In Paris's eagerness to emphasise that the Pope's letter was an approved and legitimate one, he gives us a glimpse of exactly the kind of collaborative and performative production of letters that I propose took place when Edward I's correspondence was of the highest political significance. In Paris's account, while the embassy was in Rome, a holy hermit had a vision in which St. Peter instructed him to tell the confessor that the Pope had forgiven his vow, but that he should instead restore the Abbey Church at Thorney, which is to say Westminster, as an act of piety. The hermit's letter describing this vision, shown here, arrived shortly before the papal bull announcing the outcome of the royal mission to Rome, and it bore, as Paris tells us, material signs of authority, written on parchment, sealed with wax. Nevertheless, it was initially suspected of being inappropriate for a fully public reception. Oops. We're done. There we go. To read the hermit's letter aloud before the entire court posed a risk to the political stability of the realm and the king's honour, and therefore only select few were permitted to hear it. Paris notes that the king initially had the hermit's letter read in a closed council, not permitting it to be seen or heard by anyone except in the company of those closest to him. This was a selected audience who could be trusted to hear and therefore to read, which is to say interpret, the letter with the king's interests at heart. Their counsel would be important to him in deciding how to respond, but equally their inclusion in the experience of hearing and responding to the letter was a sign of their special political status. In contrast, although for similar considerations, when the Pope's reply arrived from Rome, it was read openly with the widest possible dissemination. The entire baronage assembled to hear this great message, and the messengers made their report, reading to everyone what they had in writing, as well as the vision recorded and sent to the king by the holy hermit. So the reading of the papal letter thus illustrates how recipients could manipulate a theatre of reception for political purposes, just as producers of letters could do the same. Its proclamation in open assembly ultimately served to bind the hearers together as a political community centred on the king, while ensuring their communal recognition of his absolution from his vow. We see here how an exquisite sensitivity to audience and circumstances of both production and reception of letters was part of the English political imagination. And I argue that it was also an important element of English royal epistolary practice. So to conclude, what I've attempted to do this morning or this evening is to give you a flavour of how I work with royal letters and the kind of agency that I see them exercising in the generation of certain kinds of political identity and affinity. I've also hinted at moments when even a canny manipulator of language like Edward failed to use rhetoric appropriately, when the power of his words failed. In the book, I do explore this question in greater detail in the final couple of chapters. And I argue there that as circumstances of the reign placed the king's authority and particularly his fiscal position under increasing pressure, he responded ultimately by withdrawing from the effort of rhetorical persuasion that I've discussed today and retreating into a simpler, more jussive discourse associated with the Privy Seal, corresponding extensively with officials whose duty it was to obey and avoiding the ambiguities of request and persuasion. That, however, needs to be a tale for another day, or perhaps one to digest at your leisure in written form. I hope at the very least that I've given you reason to consider that English royal correspondence was more than a bureaucratic application of formulae, and that Edward's correspondence warrants recognition as a form of political language and symbolic power. Thanks very much for your attention. And if your appetite has been whetted, here is a cheeky discount code for you if you fancy a copy. Thanks very much.